So, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining for this very important webinar. And we are grateful to Lal Path Lab for being the sponsor for this session. Um, can I request Dr. Atima Kohli to set the ball rolling?
Yeah, thank you, sir. Good evening, everyone. We hope everyone is safe and healthy in this pandemic times. I'm Dr. Atima Kohli from Genevol, the Genetic Testing Division of Dr. Lal Path Labs. I welcome all the faculty and participants in this session on advanced lung cancer and molecular testing in the middle of COVID-19 second wave in the SARC region. Coming to our panelists and speakers, our moderator, Dr. Purvesh Parekh, needs no introduction, though he is the Chief Advisor of MOC, Precision and Medical Oncologist, Asian Institute of Oncology, Mumbai. We have with us Dr. K. Govind Babu, Consultant Medical Oncology, St. John's Hospital, HCG, Bangalore. Dr. Randeep Singh, Director and Senior Consultant, Department of Medical Oncology, NH, Gurgaon. We have Dr. Indu Bansal, Director and Senior Consultant, Department of Radiation Oncology, NH Hospital, Gurgaon. We have Dr. Vamshi Krishnan, Director, Medical Oncology and Hematology, AIG Hospitals, Hyderabad. Dr. T.P. Sahu, Senior Consultant, Department of Medical Oncology, Silverline Hospital, Bhopal. From CARIS team, we have Dr. Vasanthi Natarajan. She is the Vice President, Global Medical Affairs there. Dr. Kshitij Joshi, Senior Consultant, Department of Medical Oncology, MOC, Mumbai. From Dr. Lal Path Labs, we have Dr. Atul Tathai. He is heading our molecular department. Before we move forward to today's interactive session, I would like to brief about the Genevol and Dr. Lal Path Labs. As you all are aware that genomic space is changing dynamically, and nowadays genetic testing are vital for the treatment and patient management. Genevol has been launched to give a one-stop solution to all the oncologists for their needs in the genetic testing and in the area of precision medicine. As the largest diagnostic chain of India, we wish to take the genetic testing from biology to health and health to society. To support this objective, we are equipped with highly technical team in the field of histopathology, transplant immunology, molecular diagnostics, cytogenomics, and flow cytometry. All the departments at our National Reference Lab are highly advanced with latest platforms available. Maybe it is Iron Torrent S5 or it is a DECO platform in IHC. Starting from real-time PCR to high-end NGS, basic karyotyping to microarray, normal IHC to digital pathology, we have all these latest technologies in-house, which makes us a state-of-art lab to serve all the genetic needs. To support our clinicians, we have India's largest network of sample collection and customer care. We serve highest standards of quality report involving the latest IT solutions. On the academic front, we keep organizing many academic events, CMEs, and keep associating with the key opinion leaders for various scientific projects as well. We are the India's first NABL and CAP approved lab. To build the medical knowledge, we are officially partners with the institutes like IGIB and companies like Cellmax, Caris, Roche, and Thermo Fisher. Taking no further time, I would hand over it to Dr. Purvesh to take it further. Over to Dr. Purvesh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ratima. We'll quickly move to the panel discussion. So the panelists, esteemed panelists have already been introduced by Ratima. Thank you very much. What are we talking about today? If you look at new lung cancer cases, and this is ICMR projection for the year 2020, it is 14 lakh cancer cases, of which 12% are lung cancer, that is 1,68,000. And non-small cell lung cancer is 85% of these, that is 1,42,800. And advanced or metastatic disease will be seen in about half of them, that is 68,000. And then if we assume that the targetable driver mutations are seen in 36%, it amounts to 24,676 patients. And I think that is a significantly large number for us to be careful about what we are doing. Now, everything that we discussed today is based on a survey that was conducted, in which I have to thank 358 responders, of which 298 were from India and 56 were from other SAARC countries. We also had one each from Oman, UK, US, and Australia. These four have been eliminated from the assessment evaluation that we are going to present today. And this is going to be published in the International Journal of Molecular and Immuno-Oncology. And some of the co-authors are here as esteemed panelists today. Now, let me start with Dr. Govind Babu. Has he joined?
Yeah, I'm here, Purish.
Okay. As SAARC president, you have done many programs and also visited Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. How does India compare to other SAARC countries as far as lung cancer management is concerned?
Yeah, I have to sadly state the fact that the situation in these countries, I think Bangladesh is slightly better, but all the other countries, I think they're in a situation where India was 30 years ago.
Wow.
But I think they're slowly picking up, and because of the SAARC Federation of Oncology, which you were also president earlier, I think we have helped them actually to understand things better, and we are definitely helping them in terms of improving the capacities, actually.
Yes, yes.
So we're doing a lot of capacity building for them, and you're also actively involved in that.
Right, right.
So slowly they are coming up.
Right. You mentioned Bangladesh, so I must ask you, there are several drugs which are available from Bangladesh, which are targeting agents, and they are significantly cheaper.
Yeah.
What is your experience or perception about those?
So I have not used them. So when I was there, I spoke to a lot of people who are using it.
Right.
Just to give an example of osimertinib, there are 4 local companies which make, but they have trust in only one company. So they don't use the other 3. Okay. Most of them don't use.
Right. Excellent. Yeah. Thank you, Govind. Now, coming back to our survey of 354 responders from SAARC region, 58.9%, that is 209 were medical oncologists, but 107 were radiation oncologists, which form 30% of our responders. And I think I have to thank Dr. Indu Bansal for doing this and helping us. So this is the first time we have such a wonderful participation from radiation oncologists. So I would like to ask Dr. Indu Bansal, have radiation oncologists started taking more interest in molecular testing driven targeted therapy for lung cancer?
So definitely, I would agree to that, because I think interest in molecular oncology for radiation oncologists stemmed from management of brain tumors specifically. Yes. And then slowly we have moved on to all these specialties. And I think one reason being is that now, like for metastatic EGFR mutated lung cancer with brain metastasis, we are not offering radiation upfront, which we always used to do before. And same is the case for ALK mutated and other tumors. So I think that is one of the reasons that now we know that every cancer is molecular oncology driven, and as radiation oncologists, we have to keep our knowledge abreast. In molecular oncology, we want to treat our patients well. So many of our patients now come to us and ask for immunotherapies also. So we definitely need to know about molecular oncology from management of lung cancer point of view.
Awesome. And since lung cancer patients are living longer, I'm sure you must be seeing more of the patients coming with metastasis to the brain.
Yeah.
Earlier, they were, not surviving that long, but now we have 2, 3, and even 5 years survival. So obviously, your work is going to increase for lung cancer as well.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now we come to what is the background of seniority for the survey people, and you can see that almost half, 43%, had more than 10 years of practice. So this means that whatever we are getting from the survey is sufficiently robust for to rely on that. And if you look at the lung cancer practice setting, we can broadly divide them into government hospitals or charitable hospitals without a postgraduate degree, as shown in blue, which is 11.9%. Government hospitals with a postgraduate degree, which is shown in red, which is 26.6%. Corporate hospitals without a postgraduate degree course, that is almost 30%. And corporate hospitals with a degree course, that is 29%. The remaining are either in solo practice or group practice. So this is a very good spread across all the various practice settings that we have for lung cancer management. So I'm going to ask Dr. Randeep and Dr. Sahu. Both of them have done DM in medical oncology from one of the best oncology teaching hospitals. And now they are very successful in corporate hospitals. So let me start with Dr. Randeep and then we'll move to Dr. Sahu. What are the differences that you have noticed between the two for molecular testing driven targeted therapy in lung cancer? Randeep first.
Sir, it has been a long time. Both of us have finished our training. So definitely, even if you see last 4 or 5 years, there has been a sea change.
Yes.
Both with respect to targeted therapy as well as using immunotherapy in target positive lung cancer. I mean, immunotherapy takes a setback whenever we talk about using it upfront. And what I feel is that when your numbers are less in your private practice as compared to teaching hospitals, I mean, you may be seeing 40, 50 cases of lung cancer and here you're seeing 10, 15, 20 maximum in a month. There is a difference. You tend to do as much molecular testing as you can. Only I feel if because of the pandemic, the expanded access program have all gone haywire. But when we were having expanded access program in place, we were very, interested even to look upon MET as well as the NTRK because the expanded access was very much in place and used. That is a setback during the pandemic period.
Got it.
As far as the testing, definitely it has improved by almost, I will say, 75 to 80% in last 5 years in the practice.
Perfect. Dr. Sahu, what is your opinion? Is Tarini connected?
Sahu, you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry. So a point is when I was also doing a DM, we rarely ever used to have a testing except for probably EGFR. We had a drug, the only Gefitinib was available. So, but right now, as I get it, all of us are definitely pushing for a molecular testing, at least in the non-squamous variety. And that's for sure. And that is definitely there, except for some very poor patients who would not be there, because I am also taking Ayushman Bharat. So that is a tricky thing sometimes because this tests are not free of cost in the Ayushman Bharat scheme. So that is a subtle difference where sometimes I have to compromise and sometimes patients of that state are not ready to wait for that 20 days, 15 days for the test and they want something to be treated quickly. So that is the only chunk of patients I would not, and that also I do it with their consent. Otherwise, for every other patient, for me today, it's a molecular testing. And I prefer the broad panel NGS if I have to do that.
So Sahu has actually taken over my questions. And he has anticipated what I'm going to ask. So that's a fantastic job. Thank you, Sahu. And two very important points that you have brought out. One is that cost is a factor. And for people who are taking treatment under Ayushman Bharat, even if they want, it is not possible to do that. The second is patient preferences. They are not willing to wait, and that forces oncologists to start the treatment even before the report becomes available. And we'll come to both these points later. Now, let us look at COVID, and I'm sure this is something which is well known, but I just wanted to put into perspective how COVID first started in SAARC countries. And it was not simultaneously. For Nepal started first on 24th January. The first case in India was on 30th January. And Bangladesh, in fact, has started having the cases as late as 7th of March. So let us see what is the effect of the COVID first wave on the lung cancer practice. And I was happy to see that at least almost 12% had no effect at all. But 89% said that the lung cancer practice reduced during the first wave of COVID-19. Now let us look at some very interesting data. This is data from Dr. Gupta from Sarvodaya Hospital in Faridabad. The greenish blue lines represents the patients receiving chemotherapy in his department in 2019. And the red bars actually represents patients who received chemotherapy in 2020. And you can see that except for August, everywhere during the first wave of COVID pandemic, actually the number of patients that he was treating was higher. Very interestingly, August was the month when the lockdown was released in the NCR area, and some of his patients probably went to their old doctors in Delhi instead of continuing treatment there. But very soon they realized that they were getting the same treatment under Dr. Gupta, and so they came back, and that is how it has happened. Now you might say this is a one-off thing, but actually it is not a one-off thing. If you look at Mumbai Oncocare centers, their daycare chemotherapy follows the same pattern. The light bluish green is 1920, the red bars are 2021. And you can see that when the India's first peak happened on 11th September, they had more patients than the previous year. And even when the first trough was there on 8th February, they had more patients. So Kshitij, I would like to ask you, what do you think MOC has done that made people continue to take chemotherapy under your care, even though there was the first wave of COVID was all around us?
Yes, sir. So I represent a group practice which includes 10 medical oncologists, and we have a 5-center operated Mumbai and Nasik. So during the COVID time, when the people were afraid of taking chemotherapies in the hospital because there are chances of COVID cross infection, then we made it sure that all COVID precautions are taken in our daycare center, and which was possible because it was a small logistic there. And we tried to make it as a non-COVID facility. We had taken care for staff, like providing all PPE kit, masks, strict sterility use, and for patients there is a temperature check, and also only one patient's relative allowed. So all these precautions were taken, and because of that, patient has developed that confidence that our treatment will be taken care of here without much problem and without much cross infection due to COVID. And we were succeeded in that, and these numbers suggest that we were doing more chemotherapies than nearby any hospitals during this period.
Fantastic. That's good. Now, the survey was done in November, at which time about half the responders were facing the second wave. I'm sure all of us agree that today now we are in the midst of the second wave, and I don't think we should dispute or discuss this further. So now, Indu, at NH, what change did you make in the radiotherapy policy for lung cancer management during the COVID pandemic?
So one was, as Dr. Kshitij also said, the safety of not just the patients but the staff. That was important. I'm not going to elaborate that much, but I think the specific things which worked out was sanitizing the couch before each and every patient, changing the disposable sheet before each and every patient, sanitizing, temperature check, keeping all the masks separately. All these were the things which were for the safety. Now, as regards changes in treatment, I think we went to some hypofractionated treatments, like for hemoptysis management. If some patient came, then it was 20 in 5 more frequently offered rather than 30 gray in 10 fractions. Or like for patients with brain metastasis, single mets or oligometastasis, we offered more of SRS or FSRS, 2 to 3 fractions to brain or to the bony metastatic site, rather than protracted treatments of 30 in 10 fractions. Or if any patient was only for radiation, then 55 grain, 25 fractions, or hypofractionation, where no concurrent chemo was used, was the option. So we minimized the number of treatments, so to minimize the hospital visits to the patient and ensure the safety of the patient, the caregiver, as well as the staff and the nursing team and the doctors.
Perfect. Thank you. So, Vamshi, can I ask you, you shifted from one corporate hospital to another, overlapping during the COVID pandemic. Now, for your lung cancer patients who are already under your management, did you find any challenges of how you manage them from one center to the other?
So in my case, actually, both the hospitals were established centers, both already had facilities for managing patients. So I think a lot of my patients shifted with me. Some, of course, stayed back. That's what normally happens. Yeah. There was no real challenge in that sense because the hospitals are just 4 kilometers apart from each other. So in my case, it wasn't really a big challenge that way.
Right. Excellent. But you were able to communicate with your patients, old and new, about your movement, and they were able to understand very clearly what you were doing.
So yes, I was able to do that. Patients generally call me, they keep in touch with me. So I was able to inform them that I have moved, could inform some in advance that I was moving the next month. So it was okay. And again, like I said, within the city, the distance is not too far between the two centers. So I was able to manage that way.
Awesome. Now, I will ask Govind, Randeep, and Sau in that order. How has COVID pandemic, especially the second wave, affected your lung cancer practice? And I saw Sau putting some comments in the chat box. So we will take all of those comments here. Govind, let me start with you. What happened to your numbers? Did the stage of the patients who reached you change? And did you do any changes in the management? Govind, you will have to unmute yourself.
So ours is a standalone oncology center. So what has been established is a screening fever clinic upfront, and then the patients come in. I don't find too much of changes that have happened even during the second wave. The numbers are more or less the same. The old patients who are continuing have continued to come, and referrals are continuing. So I don't see too much of a change.
So
we are
go ahead, sorry.
We are more worried about the patients now and the staff as well, because as you have seen, our state is having a lot more cases this time, but so far so good.
In one of the earlier webinars, Ullas Batra had made a statement that the number of COVID positive lung cancer patients he saw in the first wave, that many numbers he has seen in the 1 month of the second wave. So are you also having a similar experience?
No, I'm not having that experience.
Okay. Randeep, what about your situation?
Sir, for us, the second wave has been much more strong and frightening. I mean, I think everyone knows, and yes, it is very well reflected in the practice. The new patients have reduced, and as Govind Babu sir said, the old patients definitely they are continuing, but the new referrals have drastically gone down. And yes, it is the truth. We have not seen as much COVID and cancer in last 1 year, which we have seen in last 15 days, rather, I will say 15, 20 days.
Right.
Unfortunately, the practice has been affected in last 1 month, and both the new referrals have gone down by 30-40%. Old patients, touchwood, are continuing, but 1/3 of them are getting COVID and they are in quarantine right now. And that applies to lung cancer also.
All right. So if you have a new patient with suspected lung cancer coming today, and you're fearful of what is happening because of the COVID second wave, do you go for a formal biopsy, or you feel that liquid biopsy is better and safer in this circumstance?
No, sir. There is no change in SOP. As far as irrespective of the wave, the standard operating practice and the guidelines are of biopsy, and same are being followed for the new patient. Though they may be deferred if there is a, for example, if there is a we have 2 new patients this week. Yes. But there is not much tumor load. There is one oligometastatic lung. One is not having any visceral met. So we have told them that you can wait for, as you are not in any crisis, for 2-3 weeks till COVID pandemic settles down. But all other practices like biopsy, sending for a reflex testing or molecular are the same. Absolutely.
Right. So let's say that one patient got fever and he had done a CT scan. The CT scan does not show COVID, but it finds that he has early stage lung cancer. Let's say stage 2 lung cancer. What would you do in current pandemic second wave?
Sir, if there is a fever, we would like to do a COVID RT-PCR at day 2, day 3. I mean, of course, a home isolation for 7 days at least. Right. If there is fever. And we tend them to, I usually tell all the patients to hold for first 24 to 48 hours at least of fever. Because of the panic, many times patients do the RT-PCR in first 24 hours. It comes negative, then they become careless, and then they keep on moving around in the hospital and outside. So I always tell them, wait for 2 days, get your RT-PCR, home isolation for 5 days, observe it. Once they're cleared for COVID, then they follow the standard is surgery, otherwise CT-RT, depending upon, if it's a stage 2, most probably it will be a surgery directly.
So your surgeons are willing to operate right now in the COVID second wave?
Sir, right now, no. You ask about right now, last 10-15 days, it is not about surgeons are willing, but the hospital infrastructure across the Delhi NCR is
cannot cope with it.
Because even it's a fact, we are short of ventilator, we are short of oxygen.
Correct,
both the things. And for thoracic malignancies, both of them are important.
All right.
Yeah, I think
Dr.
this gives
Rao,
us
what
an
have been?
opportunity. Purvish, one
Yeah,
comment.
go ahead,
I
go
think
ahead.
this we should use this as an opportunity to look at neoadjuvant therapy for these patients. I think we should try that.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, somebody else told me that they were forced to give neoadjuvant therapy because surgeons were not willing to operate.
Yes.
So for me, sir, it has been the first wave and second wave is a drastic change, a way that has been there. I saw actually a rise in my patients in the first wave. The numbers, what Ullas told, I echo that. I have also chatted that what I saw some 50 odd patients with cancer with COVID in the 5 months from May to December. But in this 1 month, I've seen 250 or something with positive cases.
Oh my
yes,
God.
and there was a day which I saw 22 of my patients positive. So I had a 50 odd positivity rate on that day. Second thing is that the number of patients with cancer has come down in the second wave in second cities. If you do a survey for this, that will be a very interesting thing, which you will find probably. And I've spoken with my colleagues in second cities. It has mostly affected all of the practice now. So people are fearful. They are not moving out of the houses and they're avoiding. Last, what if I can add on to what others have told is I saw 3 patients this week, new lung cancer. 2 CT scan machines were not available for biopsy. One, I did a biopsy from liver because it was USG guided. The other 2, because the CT scan machine was working full time, 120, 180 patients, 30 for the HRCT COVID. And all the patients were COVID positive. So even the center was a little skeptical, and the waiting list was too long for me to even do that. So I have deferred both the CT scan to 10-15 days because they were low bulk disease, as Dr. Randeep told. So there are drastic changes what has happened in the first wave and in the second wave.
Correct. Excellent. Thank you.
And are we operating for not lung cancer? If I speak of cancer, we stopped for 10-15 days because the crisis was too acute. Yes. Now we have started taking 1 case per day.
Okay, excellent. That's good news. Now let's come to molecular testing. In the survey, when we asked that, how does molecular testing directed therapy change the overall survival in your patients? 74% have said that the overall survival increased by 1 to 50%. Now I will request all the panelists one by one that in your practice in the real world, how much increase in overall survival have you seen because of molecular testing directed therapy? Let's start with Govind first.
Yeah, Purvish, in fact, I'm now seeing patients surviving beyond 5 years with targeted therapies. One of them is actually on an ALK inhibitor study of Novartis. He has brain metastasis and he has finished 5 years.
Excellent.
So I think it's definitely important to look at definite targetable pathways and use the right drug.
Right. Well, Randeep, what is your experience?
Sir, I think if you talk about, doing not at all even EGFR ALK ROS, then this figure definitely fits in. But if you compare NGS versus EGFR ALK ROS, then the difference may be just 15-20% or 10 to 15%. But yes, doing only biopsy and only doing adenosquamous versus EGFR ALK ROS, yes, the difference may be easily around 45-50%.
Right.
Because we have actually high percentage of driver mutation in this continent.
Right. Indu, what has been your experience?
Sir, I would also agree that definitely the post-targeted testing, the survivals have gone up, and metastatic patients are also surviving much longer. And we have also options of radiation. We have options of repeated radiation for single met or multiple mets, and the quality of life of the patients, of metastatic patients, has also gone up. And now with the option of PD-L1 also, so patients have multiple options. Earlier they had just 1 or 2 options.
Correct.
And so definitely that follicular testing has improved survival results by definitely 25 to 30%, I would say.
Awesome.
The quality of life has definitely improved for the patients.
It has. Vamsi?
Sir, definitely it has improved. There's no doubt about it when you talk of EGFR, ALK and ROS. Like Randeep is saying, I'm not too sure whether we are able to find those differences in the HER2/neu. We don't have a drug there. HER2/neu do badly.
Yes.
BRAF, again, not too much experience. But definitely in the EGFR, ALK space, 5 years plus, we are seeing survivals. And
Wonderful.
Very gratifying to treat patients with oral drugs and see them just being well.
Right. Bhopal, how you have challenges in terms of affordability. So what has been your experience?
So I think if there is a person who comes with open mind and not really in the BPL, not real BPL, there are some pseudo BPLs around. so if that is there and you convince them that this is a drug which will change the way we treat and your survival changes, I have seen 80% of them do the test.
Right.
That's point number one. Point number two, can I ask Dr. Nindu, she put out a comment that radiotherapy, she does not give in all molecular driven patient like EGFR ALK, let's assume, for anyone with brain mets. So does it apply to symptomatic also? That was a very interesting comment coming from radiation oncologist. Does it apply to symptomatic brain mets also? A quick yes or no, irrespective of the TKI which they use, because the data is only for the upper TKIs. So that's short. That was an interesting comment which I.
So I would like to make it very clear here. It depends on what molecular drug also the patient is taking.
That's
so if it's CNS non-penetrating drug, then of course I would not like to defer radiation, even if it's an asymptomatic patient. And it depends on the number of metastases.
Okay, that's okay.
Also depends on the overall systemic burden of the disease as well. So if it's a low metastatic burden, 1 or 2 mets, a patient is on CNS penetrable drug, then I would be happy to defer radiation.
Thank
but
you.
for meds, large meds, definitely radiation would be upfront.
Thank you.
Kshitij, what has been your experience or your group's experience?
Yeah, I perfectly agree with the previous panelist about this testing. This is just to see that in EGFR ALK space, there is a tremendous difference in the survival. So nowadays, what I remember during our residency, we used to start this gefitinib without even testing EGFR in female or adeno. And now in our private practice in MOC, almost each and every non-small cell lung cancer is being tested with this at least EGFR ALK, and we almost we have a data in front of us. So if you allow me, I can just tell you the percentage.
Yes, please tell us.
So I have just gone through a percentage. Almost 274 lung cancer were diagnosed in last 1 year, and out of which we did 45% NGS were done upfront, and out of 55% of reflex testing was done, 40% with the entire panel, and 10% only EGFR. So we try to use at least whatever if the free vouchers are available, and each and every patient should be tested with this testing, because they have an excellent result that already panelist has discussed, that we have seen 3, 4, 5 years of survival with this. So we should do for each and every indicated patient that we have followed.
So if you have done NGS for almost half or more than half of your patients of lung cancer, that is really impressive. Well done.
Yes.
So I don't need to tell you much. All of us are familiar with why biomarker-driven treatment of advanced lung cancer has totally evolved and changed the landscape. And you have this publication about reach non-small cell lung cancer. This was on the CCO just last month. And they say that if you look at EGFR, ALK, ROS, BRAF, RET, MET, and NTRK, only these 6, then 35% of patients have a driver mutation. We of course know that in India, EGFR is much more than the Caucasian population. So I'm going to ask Govind and Kshitij, do you follow reflex testing for multiple genes in your practice for non-small cell lung cancer? Kshitij has actually already answered, so I'll just stick to Govind for this.
Yeah, the practice that I am now in, I always ask for a NGS. In fact, it is done in-house. We do a 500 gene panel for most of our tumors. So that includes lung also. And
does it also include PDL1 testing as a part of the...
No, PDL1 is a separate one. It is not a part of the full gene panel.
Right. Kshitij, what about you? Do you also do simultaneously PDL1 when you do NGS for non-small cell lung cancer?
Yes, sir. We try to advise them to do upfront in all patients. But whenever there is some financial issues, and then we try to avoid this and just get them reflex testing for EGFR ALK ROS at least.
Right. Now, this is again the real world data, and it says that globally EGFR testing is done in 87% of patients with non-small cell lung cancer interestingly, though BRAF is a part of broad panel testing, there is no data actually published, and I am not sure why this has happened. Now, Randeep, let me start with you. What are the factors that prevent more appropriate molecular testing for non-small cell lung cancer in India? Sau has already given 2 points. Now I'm going to ask Randeep and Vamshi to answer that.
So the two most important factors, one factor which is the cost. It is still,
Yes.
I mean, still even if the patient, many patients still even, I mean, the average cost is around 30,000, 40,000. Below that, it's very difficult to get a good NGS.
Yes.
Even many patients, they feel, because if they ask you that yes 100% you will get the report as target positive, that does not happen.
Of course.
That is one thing. Second is that most of the hospitals or the daycare setups, I will say in the private practice, almost 75 to 80% are still outsourcing, and they are not doing it almost to the tune of 80%, and that is one of the most important factor which leads to reduction in the NGS. And third is the turnover time. We may still say 2 weeks, but it never happens. It is 3 weeks or more. Whatever lab you may pick up, I have tried every lab which we can talk about in Delhi NCR as well as in South and North India. It takes around 3 weeks if it is out of the house. These are the three most important factors which are the hindrance. Otherwise, I mean, it is beyond doubt. And standardization, QC, when they are not in house, these factors definitely puts NGS at a slightly on the back foot. Otherwise, if all these factors are covered, I think all 100% of the adenos, especially the non-smokers, will go under NGS in any practice. I mean, any setup practice.
You also mentioned that because of the COVID situation, and the patient assistance programs are hampered, and therefore some of the testing might have gone down.
Sir, international, the drugs which we were getting across the border now, the access, that has actually hampered. Within the country, we are still able to do like getting coupons for EGFR alcohols that are available. Labs are doing it, but to get the drugs like RET inhibitors and MET inhibitors as well as NTRK, that are becoming quite difficult. Earlier, the time the TAT for the compassionate access drugs were around 4 weeks to 5 weeks, and now it has become around 8 weeks, and some of them have at least closed expanded access.
Correct. Vamshi, what has been your experience, or what are your factors?
So Randeep hit the nail on the head. It's the TAT, it's the cost. I think these two are very, very important. Added to this, maybe one factor which does play, though it is not so important now, is the amount of tissue we are getting. This usually happens when patient already gets done outside, not a very good lab. You have only little bit of tissue. Patient is unwilling to get a repeat test. That is not as much now as it was 5 years back. So that's a good thing. But the time and the cost and these are very
Got it. So this is the IASLC data, and this was a survey of 2,537 oncologists treating lung cancer from 102 nations. And these were the three most important factors they have identified. One is dissatisfaction with molecular testing, performing as well as interpreting the assay. Second was the unawareness of recent guidelines. And in that part, they have said that the lowest awareness was in Asia, rest of the world. Of course, we will always argue against that, saying that in India, the awareness is no less than any other part of the world. And the third is interpretation challenges. So there is trouble understanding results. So I would like to ask the panelists, do we still have interpretation challenges? It may not be within your center because you are all centers of excellence, but do you think that the community oncologist has a problem of how to understand and how to take action on the molecular report that comes to them? So Govind, I'll start with you again.
Yeah, I think so far as medical oncologists treating lung cancer across India, I don't think there's a problem.
Right.
The problem arises when non-qualified medical oncologists, non-qualified people start treating these patients.
Yes.
So that is the issue. Then the other thing is, there was a publication by Dr. Jack West in 2019 about the similar thing in US. And he collected data from Foundation Medicine of testing for 3,500 patients.
Right.
And his conclusion was that even in the US, the awareness is woefully low for testing and using the targeted therapies. So, yeah, I was surprised when I saw this. And he said only 60% of the patients who should get anti-EGFR are getting, and only 70% you should get anti-ALK targeting. So even in the US, it is a big problem.
Right.
Sir, Sahu here.
Yes,
I just a little bit differ from Govind sir. I feel even in the medical oncology community, I would not no figure for that point, but most of us still are not able to read a NGS report properly.
No, Sahu, I'm not talking of the NGS report.
No. So what I know, I understand. But my point
Yeah.
is what sir told is a molecular testing. If I look at the profile, that would be the most difficult report because of there are a lot of standards which we are not aware of. As we are more comfortable EGFR, ALK standalone reflex testing.
Right.
So what we need is definitely people are not comfortable. People are not comfortable with the allele frequency and what allele frequency would be a more significant, which you at a lower can be significant. I think it's a complex test, and we are still in our post-graduation DM. When we did it, we had not gone through that details, and definitely it's a learning experience. Out of interest, we have learned it because that's how it is now. But I feel still, sir, I feel still most of us do not know how to interpret the NGS report in the correct way. That if I can put my foot out, that's what
I agree with you, Sahu. And in fact, Purvish, that's why we started this Society for Molecular Oncology to update ourselves every time.
Correct.
Let's see what others have to say.
So, yeah, Randeep, what is your opinion?
Sir, I agree. I mean, there are two ways to look upon. Dr. Sahu is right. If you go in the exact, I mean, if you think that a medical oncologist will be seeing as same as the person who's performing the NGS, we are still far from that point. I think what Sahu wants to say, we can understand EGFR, and as a medical oncologist, we will realize it is a 18, 19, 20, 21, they are different. We can see ALK, we can realize when EGFR and ALK are occurring together, we slightly fumble in our confidence. When we see some rare mutation, for example, I may see a BRAF V600E, I know what to do, but if I see a non-V600E, I still start fumbling. So all those things which a molecular oncologist or a person who is actually performing the NGS, who realizes that the quality checks and others, that we are still far in India with them. But otherwise, clinical part we know. For example, if someone tells me that, yes, there is EGFR and ALK complex, and the VAF, which we call it as variant allele frequency of ALK, is much higher, and then you have to treat, then I know what to do. But somewhere realizing that the reads were proper, whether the depth was proper, and I don't know why we are always mad about the number of genes. I have realized in last 3-4 years, I mean, how does it matter? Of course, when you go deep, the number of genes increase, but for us, I'm always worried about seeing those 15-20 genes in the panel, and some panels are so useless that it is a 500 gene panel. For example, a lung cancer has a 500 gene panel, but by chance, if they are missing a MET or a BRAF, that is not of use to me. So number of genes does not matter, but the depth and the reads matter to me. So all these things, I mean, we are still far from the intricacies of
Very true.
Yeah, I think we always have to take help of our molecular lab people for many of the things for interpretation. That way we are lucky here. Yes.
I think one thing which is a bit overhyped now is the liquid biopsy, especially the labs which are just pushing for CTC and liquid biopsy. CTC is something which I think I made this point in other meetings as well.
Yes.
So we have had I have had 2 patients where a CTC gave a report as a squamous cell carcinoma with a KRAS mutation, and the final biopsy report, when he repeated it, came as EGFR positive adenosine.
Wow.
They're totally different. I mean, CTC is something we really should not be relying on at this point. Maybe 6 months later, I'll be happy to eat humble pie. But I think that's something we need
Vamshi, I think talking about histology on liquid biopsy is wrong.
Yes. I agree with you, sir, but that's why we're pushing it, saying that it can be as good as solid.
No, not at all.
Kshitij, since you have been doing
a small comment, I think
go ahead, Randeep.
What we have learned is, at least that much we have learned in molecular oncology, that this lab is good or bad. In 4 years before, we never used to realize that A, B, C, D, E, we are outsourcing. And that much Sahu will agree that by your experience and seeing the reports and burning your hands, we have learned that much, that I'm not talking about any lab here. I mean, if we have 5 labs, we now know that yes, you can rely for this test on this lab in molecular oncology.
Correct.
I agree with all panelists, Dr. Sahu and Dr. Randeep. So there is a difficulty in interpreting. There is no problem with EGFR, all cross and all other things that everybody is aware and all medical oncologists can treat it. But the problem arises when there is an NGS report in front of us which shows KRAS mutation and suppose the cabozantinib will work. So this whether this is this should be followed, what is to be done. Means I'm just giving one example. So where we need, like our own oncologists need expertise, we need to discuss with this NGS report and how to use this NGS report, except for this all standard testing. So that's why more information and more understanding of NGS is very, very important.
Right, right.
One more thing, sir, we are now seeing this trend of sending for this gene culture sensitivity and drug sensitivity. And there is in Greece, which people send to. I don't know how useful those are. That is, I don't know the rest of the panel, but that's something again which is kind of difficult to accept.
So Govind
one more comment. Sorry.
Yeah. Still clinical, not for routine use, still research. But I have used it in second, third line where we have exhausted all the options. Not first line, never.
Yeah, same comment about this thing, because there are some labs, they are doing this drug sensitivity testing. There is a good article about gemcitabine sensitivity in the pancreatic cancer, but I don't know about the lung cancer, how it is practically useful. But there are some labs which they do a drug sensitivity testing, and we come up with a report that cisplatin is sensitive, paclitaxel is sensitive, and this is less sensitive. And how do you interpret it, how to use it, whether in vivo this is useful, I don't know, Miss. Anybody can comment on it.
Right, right. So let's move to this very important point. After sending the sample for molecular testing, how do you decide on first line treatment for advanced lung cancer? And a small fraction said that they don't do molecular testing at all. Let's keep them aside. 25%, a quarter, said that they will wait for the report before starting treatment. But the remaining either started and continued based on clinical response, or started and changed after the report came back if it was necessary. So I think this was something that I was very curious to understand this. And Sau had mentioned that patient preference or patient's insistence on starting the treatment could be one. But what was really interesting was the difference between government and charity hospitals, 135, versus corporate hospitals, that was 188 responders. And it was 26.6% for corporate hospitals, where they would wait for the report, as opposed to 18% in the charity or government hospitals. And this was statistically significant. So, Sau, do you think that this is because of the type of socioeconomic background of the patients that come there, or what is it? Is it the large number of patients that the doctor has to see? What is happening here?
If I read it, you have been suggesting that the corporate hospitals, they wait for the report before the start. Yeah. So there are 2-3 things that could happen. What I can feel is that the corporate hospitals, most of them out of the pocket paying, they understand why they're doing a report, and they would be more inclined to wait for the report. And second would be the socioeconomic status and the condition of the general condition of the patient is most likely to be better than what you would see in a government hospital. They would have larger disease, bulkier disease. That also would be playing a role why most of the government hospital would be starting something. So how I do it, sir? I look at the disease. If that's something as a very large visceral disease, although I send the test, I would start off with a therapy because I would like the load to just get into and the patient to have some relief by the time the report comes in, and then I make the changes as required. Otherwise, if the GC is okay, bony alone, 1 or 2 occasional visceral deposits, I would prefer to wait till the patient doesn't want to wait. That's the way.
Right. Kshitij, do you do the same thing, or are there any other points?
No, I agree with Dr. Sau. So what is our current practice is that we send these samples for testing. If the patient clinically is symptomatic or there is a great visceral disease, in that condition, we will not wait. We will start first, at least give chemotherapy, and then shift to targeted therapy if the mutations are positive. If the patient is quite stable, we'll definitely convince them to wait for at least a week when the EGFR is usually available, and then we can start.
Right. Dr. Indu, what about your opinion?
So definitely, if the patient is stable, does not have too much visceral crisis, not much symptomatic, and the report is about to come, the waiting time is not too much, then we always wait for the report to come. And one thing also that I would like to tell is that if suppose any patient has a bony metastasis, any lytic lesion, which needs radiation in the meantime, so what we do at such time is that we start radiation for the patient so that patient finishes at least one line of treatment. In the meantime, by the time the molecular testing report is available. But if suppose the patient has, say, a pleural effusion, massive crisis, and sometimes you have some very insistent patients who are not at all ready to wait.
Yes.
They want to start treatment. So in certain cases, you have to start the treatment. But it all depends on the severity of the disease and the insistence of the patient and the family, and not willingness to understand the implication of the report.
Thank you. So we have gone through the biomarker barriers to biomarker testing. How can we overcome these barriers? And some of the points like cost and turnaround time have been discussed. Govind, any other point other than cost and turnaround time?
So when I was in Kidwai, what we used to do is start a project with the DM students and get some funding or tie up with one of the labs, and that way we would do. So that is one of the things. Of course, the patient assistance for many of these things from many of the MNCs exist. So at least for the basic biomarkers is possible. So those are the ways we can overcome the barriers.
Right. And some students can also apply for the molecular oncology grant of ICON
absolutely.
and take some benefit out of that.
In fact, we got some grants from our university for 2 such projects.
Awesome. Randeep, any other thoughts?
Sir, there are 2 things I think we can improve. One is insisting more to the intervention radiologist to take as much core biopsies. I also saw the similar message from Sahu in the chat box. Second is, since we have some Lalpath people also, and one thing which I've realized is that when the QC fails, it is very odd that the clinician comes to know after 15 days. For example, I have sent a tissue biopsy. One paraffin block has gone after the biopsy at the DNO-CA from my institute to Lalpath or to any lab, Lalpath, OncoQuest, anywhere code. Now, standard across the labs, I have realized that I will get a mail, or if I don't chase the sample, suddenly after 15 days, I am getting a report, I am a mail that the QC has failed. If the QC is failing, that is the first step. And if the tumor is not sufficient, then it shall be informed to the clinician at day 2, day 3, because if you come to know at day 15, then you have to again convince the patient for a repeat biopsy, send another block or a liquid biopsy, and then the whole, it's very difficult.
Yes. I think it's a very important message for all molecular path labs that they have to be actively giving feedback to the clinicians, and this is the only way that we can do our best for our patients. Vamsi, any other?
Randeep, your point about informing the intervention radiologists who do the biopsies. Purvish, I think you remember we used to do combined meetings with the pulmonologists and the radiologists. So I think that has actually helped getting yields better now.
Right. Vamsi, any other thoughts?
I think basically sensitizing people in the hospital, keeping on call reports. You do that 10 times, the 11th time they themselves will try to give you same thing molecular lab. If you interact with them, then they are also more interested because to send you back the reports and discuss with you the report. We get phone calls and saying that, look, we found this discrepancy. What do you think? And they do follow up. I won't blame them. I think a lot of the labs actually are willing to talk to the clinicians. I think from our side, sometimes you don't like talking back. I think that's attitude change which we have to inculcate.
Got it.
Great.
PDL1 testing we have already.
Sir, I would like to comment over here.
Please.
Saying that what happens is that the entire process of NGS actually takes around 10 to 12 days, more than that. And while we are doing the bioinformatics, we come to realize that, the number of reads in a particular sample is not good enough. So that is why the entire process of 15 days is actually built into the entire testing strategy.
So let me just clarify with you and Dr. Randeep that one of the things is that section of the histopathology is evaluated to see the number of malignant cells in the tissue. That will be happen before the bioinformatics comes into the picture. So Atul, is that what you do or you don't do that?
Yes, sir. So we do that. And if there is a problem at that end, then third or fourth day, we inform the clinician back that, this is the problem. But if there is a problem with the which we realize only at the bioinformatics level, then it is obviously 15 days.
Thank you very much for clarifying that. Now, in the testing methodologies, the NGS is thought to be better because it will pick up rare mutations. a RT-PCR might miss novel fusion partners, and there is a need for a break-apart probe for detecting rearrangement. So these are the clear things that I mentioned here in red. Govind, you have done a lot of collaborative work with labs doing molecular testing. Apart from these 3 points which were highlighted in red, have you found any other factors that need to be considered while doing NGS? Can't hear you, Govind.
Most important thing is I think we need to talk to the lab people.
Yes.
And we need to actually find out what is the depth they're doing, what is the platform they're using. And so with each time, with each lab, you try and build up a confidence level, and then you decide, okay, this is the best lab for you to use. But I think, even the lab people keep changing. So I think we need to have a continuous dialogue with the lab people to see what exactly we want and talk to them. So I think that's what helps.
Excellent, excellent. So pros and cons we have discussed. Now coming to liquid biopsy, and I'll start with Randeep. What are the factors that will influence you to do a liquid biopsy in non-small cell lung cancer? What patients you select, where you prefer cell-free DNA or circulating tumor DNA? Do you do it when the patient is on maintenance therapy or for early detection of recurrence? What are the factors that go through your mind?
Sir, I will start with the lower ones that are simpler. While on maintenance, if the patient is on a clinical trial, I'm willing to do it. And there is ample data that while the patients are on EGFR maintenance, you may try to check the T790M as well as whether the clone is increasing or decreasing, but that is all in the clinical study. Out of the clinical study in office, it will be actually very confusing to do maintenance as well as CTC.
Right.
CTC, as Dr. Vamshi said, and he very rightly said that CTC is actually very painful for a clinician because you have a report and it is stuck in the patient's mind that I have circulating tumor cells. And we all know that in advanced cancer, there may or may not be CTC circulating. So those two are actually more of clinical trial settings and more of under a controlled environment. Coming to the liquid biopsy, now there are two scenarios when we do in lung cancer. One is at diagnosis and second is at recurrence. Now at diagnosis, whenever you are falling short of tissue and the patient is not agreeing for a biopsy, especially in a COVID era, because you do a biopsy, there are two problems in the COVID era. Everyone wants a COVID RT-PCR in 72 hours. And then the intervention radiologist is not very happy to do a biopsy in this crisis time, especially in the last 1 month in Delhi NCR.
Yes.
So to repeat a biopsy in the crisis time of COVID, not as such during the routine COVID era, is very difficult. And second is that patient also getting subjected again and again to the radiology department, because emergency and radiology, believe us, is one of the two most infective areas when you have a overloaded hospital with COVID patients.
Very true.
So that is one. At diagnosis, if you are short of tissue, I would be happy to send a liquid biopsy, especially for a lung cancer, because if you're doing it from a good lab, then you can actually have provided you have adeno and squamous differentiated. Second is, yes, at relapse, we all know that you can use it for EGFR, especially. Even there is data coming up that for ALK resistance mutations, you can use a liquid biopsy. Of course, to detect, on liquid biopsy, you're getting RAS, MET, and RAF and MET. They are a bit difficult, but for EGFR, ALK, I think on relapse, we can still use a liquid biopsy again. And if you are negative on liquid biopsy, you can go for a reflex tissue testing.
Perfect.
That's it.
Right. I'm going to skip a few slides because I've run out of time. Vamshi, how do identifying different specific EGFR mutations influence your treatment decision making for lung cancer? And we have seen that within the 18, 19, 20, and 21, there are so many different mutations and rearrangements that we can see.
So, sir, I would divide into exon 19, L858R, T790M, rarer mutations, and exon 20. These are 5 classes where I would look at. For exon 19, I would go with osimertinib first line. For L858R, my first line would be dacometinib if there is no brain metastasis. If brain metastasis is there, probably still go with an osimertinib. Both the cases, afatinib seems to work, though it would be down only if patient cannot afford the other 2 drugs. Right. I do not personally prefer the chemo plus geftinib combination unless patient cannot afford. For exon insertion, I really have nothing to work. Chemotherapy is what I would suggest. I prefer paclitaxel carboplatin over PEM personal choice.
Perfect.
For rarer mutations, we have and osimertinib if the patient can afford.
All right.
T790M at baseline, again, nothing really works very well. Though osimertinib, there is some data for it. At progression, if you have T790M, osimertinib will be the first choice.
Right. So we know that there are resistance after first and second generation EGFR TKIs, and so also after the osimertinib. So Randeep, what is your experience with resistance to first and second generation TKIs? Do all patients get it if they survive long enough, let's say 10, 12, 13 months? And if so, how do you test for these patients?
Sir, for first generation TKIs, definitely there is an enough experience, and most of them, they do get a resistance. I mean, it is about that when you check the resistance, that may matter. Usually I check for when there is a radiological progression. Even if I'm continuing first generation, I would start checking for the resistance mechanism. Though I may not change the therapy, I may change the therapy at symptomatic progression. That is one thing I have learned. Second is that regarding the second generation TKIs, the experience is limited, but yes, as far as the literature, most of the patients will definitely progress, because usually all these EGFR inhibitor patients, they do well. Rarely you have their medical condition deteriorating so fast that you are not able to go to second line. Like in lung cancer, you start someone on a chemo therapy first line, and maybe only 30% may go to the second line chemo. Here 60%, 65, 70% are able to go to the second generation TKIs. Most of them, they go for a liquid biopsy or the reflex testing in the first generation for T790M. If the liquid is negative for T790M, then they go for tissue. For the second generation, I mean, post osimertinib, I would prefer a biopsy to rule out the EMT, small cell transformation, as well as the other mutations like MET as well as HER2 and MET amplifications. That is the difference. The first and second generation in my practice.
Perfect, Randeep. Sahu, what about you as far as osimertinib first line is concerned?
Very limited experience actually. I have the patient single digit. So and I have used the generic so-called generic version, and I have had decent responses with some of them. So still learning to use first line osimertinib, but my knowledge is more theoretical.
Right. So I think I have taken a lot of time. I thank each and every one of our esteemed panelists. A big thank you for being multitasking masters, especially when you have to fight the second wave of COVID. And I will stop sharing my slides and hand it over to our next speaker. Can I request, where is she? Vanita Natarajan, can I see you?
Vasanthi Natarajan?
Sorry, Vasanthi Natarajan. My apologies.
Oh, it's okay. Just in case there was a Vanita, I didn't want to sort of assume it was me.
So sorry. Please let us have your expert opinion. You can share your screen now.
Yeah, I'm trying to do that. Please tell me if you see my screen.
Not yet.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't do. I'm trying to share it.
If you're having difficulty, we can take Atul first.
Could you take Atul first, because there's some security problem here. Sure. Thank you.
Atul, can we take you first, please? Atul, are you there?
Sir, I'm just sharing my screen.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Atul, we can see your slide.
Yeah, sir. Yeah. So, good evening, everyone. So, what I'm going to talk about is more general in nature, and I'm after such an enthralled discussion, I'll just walk through my presentation. So, we all know that lung cancer is one of the major cancers which we deal with, and it is more than what we take together as pancreatic, prostate, breast, or colon. And targeted therapy is directed against these oncogenic driver mutations unique to tumor cells, and hence they spare the normal cells. So the must genes, as has been discussed over and over again, are the EGFR, ALK, and ROS. But a more comprehensive panel is now taking baby steps towards its clinical practice. So what we have is a panel which is a mix of FISH as well as NGS. NGS, some panels which we have do definitely cover the fusions as well, but this is a more basic kind of a panel where we do a mix of NGS and FISH because this helps us to keep the costs down. At the back end, what we are doing is a 50 gene cancer hotspot panel. So we are actually looking at 50 odd different genes and reporting most of the important genes as part of this panel. So the emerging markers in molecular testing has been very well discussed by Dr. Parekh and others. So, and exploiting these rare driver mutations for precision cancer medicine is now becoming more and more common. And there are a lot of publications which have come around such a space. So if we look at our data, EGFR is definitely one of the most common thing which we see in around 30 to 35% of the cases. What we see is EGFR mutation. We also see KRAS in quite a few percentage of the population, and then there are other which are more rarer. So in terms of the new genes, what we see is PIK3, STK1, IDH, and SMART4 as part of this panel. TP53 definitely is seen quite often, but as of now, it is not a very targetable gene to look at. And you do see such cases where everything else is negative, while these rarer genes like TP53 or a PIK3CA will come out to be positive. So why to do an extended panel? So a 65-year-old male diagnosed with metastatic adenocarcinoma was found to be positive on L858R EGFR. Started off on gefitinib, but there was no response, and been tested for BRAF, MET, RET, and in an extended kind of a panel. What we found was there was a MET amplification also there. And the therapy changed because of the MET amplification, which was also positive in this case. So another case where a 62-year-old male diagnosed with invasive carcinoma, ROS rearrangement positive, started on crizotinib, again no response. So what next to do? The answer lied in getting a more extensive panel done for maybe a BRAF, MET, RET, and others, and was found to be positive for KRAS also. So it was actually the KRAS mutation which was having a negative effect in this case. So what method should you be used for performing the molecular testing? So it actually depends on the percentage of the tumor cells what you are seeing as positive. So as was discussed by Dr. Purvesh also, that the first step once we receive the sample is to look at the percentage of tumor. And in case there is very less tumor, there is no point in doing a Sanger sequencing or a Paris sequencing. And even things like next generation sequencing stop at around 2%. So a more sensitive technique may be warranted depending on the sensitivity, the percentage tumor present. So Dr. Purvesh did touch upon the what techniques to use at what time. But one of the definite advantages of using NGS is that while you have a very good sensitivity. This can also determine copy number variations, which real-time PCR can maybe look at only one fusion per reaction. So we at the back end, what we are doing is also a OncoMinds focus assay, so which tells you which not only caters to the hotspots, but also looks at copy number variations and gene fusions. And this is based both on DNA as well as RNA. So it has been implemented worldwide by the various testing labs, and the results have been good. So a 62-year-old male, again diagnosed with an NSCLC, tested for a focus panel and was found to be positive for both KRAS as well as MET exon 14 skipping. So MET exon 14 skipping, as we all know, has been finding its space in the NCCN guidelines as well. And the therapy actually changes when you see such a mutation occurring. And it is a targetable therapy. So the report format definitely, as was being talked about, should include that what all clinically significant biomarkers have been observed and what all relevant therapies are available in which are there in which guidelines, as well as if it should also talk about the tier criteria and also tell you that what all clinical trials are going on wherever in the world, so that the patient can benefit. So a 39-year-old female, again diagnosed with adenocarcinoma, was positive for EGFR, started on gefitinib, tested, but there was no response. Again tested for ALK rearrangement, was found to be positive, given crizotinib, and the result was very good. But again, there was a reoccurrence and response is now not there. So what next? So the answer would be that to look for other targetable therapies. And in this case, what we found was that that she was actually positive for one of the mutations in ALK, and the therapy changed altogether. So we are a CAP proficient. We participate in CAP proficiency testing, and these are some of our results. Another good proficiency testing is by EMQN. I like this more than the CAP proficiency testing because it actually gives you marks based on your genotyping as well as your interpretation and other the way you are presenting your report. And they cut marks for even if you give more information. And if you look, this is not readable, but actually our marks were deducted because of the fact that we gave more information and it was more lengthier report. So it was not a clinician friendly report. So after that, we have changed our report and now it is much more clinician friendly. So why I wanted to emphasize on this point was that your proficiency testing partner also has to be very good so that you also improve over a period of time. So just to summarize that individual gene testing is still going on, but we need to graduate to multi-gene testing in view of the limited tissue because tissue should not become an issue. Liquid biopsy is a very sensitive technology, but it's a single gene mutation in gene testing, and it should not be a negative does not mean that it is negative. Or positive definitely means it is a positive, and your first choice should be a solid tissue wherever available. RNA-based sequencing will overcome most of the shortfalls of the existing NGS-based DNA sequencing, and the focus panel is a step in the right direction. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Atul. Can we move to Dr. Vasanti? Ma'am, are you ready with your slides now?
Hi, I have my slides, but there seems to be a trouble with security system in Caris, so I'm not able to upload it. I've sent them to Sankalp, and I hope it arrives. So if we could just continue with the discussion, as soon as I can share or get the slides, I will do it.
Would you, while we are waiting for your slides, would you like to make some general comments about Caris and what you are doing? I believe that you are the chief medical person in charge for the whole of Europe or globally. What is it?
Globally. So I'm not the chief. I'm the global medical affairs VP. So that would be that my role extends to the activities that we do outside of the United States. So that is Europe, Asia, Africa, South America, and Canada. I've just stepped into Caris after my former colleague, Klaus Schuster, who used to work at Caris. So I've really, I'm his successor. So yeah, today I really wanted to, after our brief conversation yesterday, Dr. Parikh, try and sort of hone in on what Caris's approach to profiling is and how we're differentiating ourselves. And I tried to find some examples to highlight our approach and why we still believe that that approach is probably the way to go in the long term. And of course, it has its downsides. I heard today during the discussion about cost and turnaround time and the amount of needed. Yes? Hello?
No, go ahead, please.
Oh, sorry. I thought someone said. And so I appreciate that. And I'm just a bit upset that I can't show you my slides because I broke down using comparators with different companies to try and dissect really systematically our approach versus other approaches and where there is a unique point that benefits the patient using the Caris approach. So I'm going to try and go to my fourth slide without you seeing it. And the philosophy that that Caris has taken is, you know, we want to leave no stone unturned. And while that sounds very esoteric, I think there is a very practical reason for that. And the why would be that time is of the essence for these patients. And the tissue is the issue in lung cancer. It's very hard to get it, and there are a lot of comorbidities when you try and access these tissues. As well as we're working, and this has become very apparent in the last 10 to 15 years, the biology and the understanding of molecular drivers in lung cancer is so complex that you need to really approach it also from a very complex perspective and look at the entire biology, be it the DNA, RNA, and the protein as well. So for these reasons, I think taking a very holistic approach is the way to go. What I wanted to then touch on was what were the influences of the decision, and what makes the physician make certain choices or impact his choice. And the size of the panel was raised, and I agree with one of the panelists who said that I think the size of the panel no longer really is an issue, because both in terms of the quality of reads, the depth and the cost, they've become, you know, quite manageable within the range of comprehensive profiling, that whether you're doing 500, 400 or 300 is no longer the point, because the bulk of these panels will include those 8 genes that have aberrations that are relevant to lung cancer. So to some extent, panel size has been very important, but I think it takes a certain backseat as you move forward with the bulk of the providers. Tissue quantity, I think this is a hard one, and many physicians do complain when there's a high number of slides or tissue requested. But if you look on aggregate what happens as a consequence of getting enough tissue, if you want to do a large enough analysis as we tend to do, then there is a requirement for that rigor to be achieved. However, superimposed on that point is that Caris in particular does microdissection. And this microdissection can enrich a tumor that comes with, say, 50% tumor, 50% normal cells, it can raise as a consequence of the microdissection to 70% tumor content. And if you get a slide cut with 50-50, you can actually raise, or 35 to 70 tumor versus normal, we can raise and enrich to 50%. And that really enables us then to do the entire panel of tests that would give the full validated CMI report. So while the tissue requirement is high, what Caris does, and consistently, is to actually microdissect. And this is something that some of our other providers do not add into the mix, so to speak. Turnaround time, I think this was also discussed. Turnaround time, we see the value of trying to cut it down, but the bulk of providers, and I used to work in FMI, you need at least 10 to 14 days in the lab to get the analysis. So I appreciate that we're working with metastatic stage 4 disease patients who really need and want their data quickly, and the doctor needs it to make the decision, but the sheer nature of the analyses takes that time. But we are working on reducing it. And one point was raised, which I thought was really interesting, and that was the point about quality control, because if a physician can find out earlier, then we can mitigate for that risk when it comes around after the long turnaround time, that there wasn't adequate tissue. So I've noted that point, and I think that's an interesting one. On the point of quality, I think this is, it's a little bit contentious. Everyone is going to say they have the best quality, the best depth, and so on. And on your request, I did look for failure rates, and I did find that we were actually able to show in a study where we looked at immunotherapies that we reduced the failure rate quite significantly versus in one of the keynote studies, quite significantly as a consequence of our analysis. Probably the bulk of that reason, we increased, you could say, the value of our TMB success rate to 94% versus in the Checkmate trial where it was 60.9%. Obviously, we attribute that primarily to the fact that we did microdissection, and therefore we could get a much better and more accurate read of the TMB. But only to say that, once again, you know, there is value in every step along the way of our process. Another example where we showed, or our data has shown that it is superior, is if you look at NTRK, there are several fusion partners. And what very often happens is if you don't do a thorough analysis across the board of your fusion partners, you will underreport consistently on some of the actionable targets because you did not thoroughly find out all the potential fusion partners. And this was actually seen with NTRK and ETV6. And again, 50% of the fusion partners were missed because they did not choose the right fusion partner with the NTRK3. So once again, thoroughness comes, or that rigor comes with a quality and a direct actionability, because we do have, of course, the NTRK inhibitors. So that was something I wanted to share. Other aspects I think that are relevant and important to highlight here is the PD-L1 testing. Most companies do PD-L1 testing for sure, but there is firstly a limited number of antibodies that the companies would choose to test. Whereas at Caris, there is always a matched tumor to the spectrum of antibodies. So in the case of non-small cell lung cancer, we use the SP142 for Roche Atezo, the 22C3 for Pembro, the 28 for Nivo, and 22C3 for Regeneron. So what we're doing is basically, if it's a non-small cell lung cancer sample, then all the 4 antibodies will be tested on that tissue. And similarly for bladder cancer, then we would only use the Atezo and Pembro relevant antibodies, and so on and so forth. So you know that when you get your PDL testing result, it has been tested exhaustively across the board for all the relevant checkpoint inhibitors that are in use in non-small cell lung cancer. So that is the kind of rigor that's being applied So to say that we do PD-L1 antibody testing isn't adequate today. You need to go to the next level and say which antibodies you're doing. And in particular in non-small cell lung cancer, it becomes all the more important because there is that spectrum of choice for the physician in terms of which antibody, which drug to use. So that's that level of detail that comes. And again, as a consequence, time and tissue requirement increases. And the last point, I'm so sorry about my slides not showing. I wanted to talk about external validation and failure rates. And I had an example here of failure rates, but I can't quite project it. But we consistently show a lower level of failure rate on a scale. We had 6 versus 39 for foundation. Exactly how contentious that is, I don't want to go into, but I think based on the way we approach systematically the analyses, I think failure rates, for example, with the NTRK3 fusion proteins, we see that explains some of the failure rates. The fact that Caris tests consistently all the antibodies when it comes for IHC for PD-L1 is another reason why the failure rates will be lower. And so they accumulate and add up to give you a more robust report. Another factor, of course, is the quality. And how do we attribute quality across the board, whether it's Guardant, Tempus, Foundation, or Caris? I think the internal quality controls are pretty robust. But we have our set of CLIA, CAP, and ISO, how shall I say, clearances. And so we feel confident that we are on par, if not superior, on the point of quality and external validation. Last but not least, I wanted to share a clinical report here, which is a sort of testimonial to how if you use an unbiased approach, as we believe we do with Caris Molecular Intelligence profiling, because we do whole exome and whole transcriptome and do as up to more than 15 proteins in the IHC testing, we pick up unknown aberrations, which are very actionable. And an example here is a patient who with non-small lung cancer who had an EGFR GRB2 fusion, which has never been identified before, and as a consequence received osimertinib. And this patient had actually failed already 4 lines of therapy. So again, you see that the power of trawling a large amount can pick up, I agree, not on a regular and frequent basis, but it does pick up valuable, actionable results, which then translate into clinical and absolutely life-saving value. So this is what I wanted to share in terms of, by leaving no stone unturned, there is something you get back in terms of dividend for that investment of quality and time. And one of my slides, the last one, was to share the plethora of targeted therapies that are associated or can be acted upon as a consequence of DNA sequencing, IHC, RNA, and other sequencings. There are more than 60 FDA-approved therapy associations with these aberrations. And therefore, you really need a multi-technology approach, because you might just be missing a trick if you do one or some. And therefore, doing all, while it takes much more time and costs more and requires far more tissue, I think it gives you that whole picture. And it's sometimes for me like the elephant, if you just look at the ears and the trunk, you forget the rest of the body, and you need to get the entire picture to understand how to best treat your patient. And that's where I'm going to end for today. And hopefully I can send my slides to you, and you could share it with the delegates or something like that. And I do apologize that I couldn't project my slides. And I'm sorry, I can't hear you. You're on mute, Dr. Parikh.
My apologies. Now, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Vasanthi, for that wonderful discussion that we had with you. And we look forward to receiving your slides. There is a very important question that one of our very senior medical oncologists has put, Dr. T. Raja, who is in charge of oncology for Apollo Cancer Hospital in Chennai. He says how Caris measures its failure rate compared to standard samples. So obviously, both this is a question for internal quality control as well as participation in an external quality assurance program. And he said if such data is available, then we can identify what is the quality and get more assurance and comfortable with the reports from Caris.
Well, I mean, the failure rates are very, very low. I don't know how familiar everyone is, but anyway, I think they're very familiar. But from an internal perspective, the controls are really very standard across FMI, whom I know, and Caris that I know now. And that is basically you have your standard mutations or aberrations which you test against, and they are your positive controls. And then you have your negative controls. And
we know all that. I don't think that is what we are asking for.
Okay.
We want actual figures, actual data.
Of how many times we fail.
Yeah,
I mean, there's a 97.7% success rate and positive predictable ability, right? So we are seeing a very high level of accuracy and low failure rate.
If you can share the figures for each of the tests that Caris is doing.
Wow, I don't know if I can get each of the tests. Maybe I could get an aggregated
molecular tests that are related to lung cancer, which is the topic of this webinar.
Yeah.
At least that could be a beginning. And both for internal control as well as the external quality, like Dr. Atul mentioned about their participation in EQUAS and what was the report given to them. So also if we have that data from Caris, that is the only way that our participants can actually trust the value and the quality of the reports that any lab is providing. So, and this is not just you, we are asking this from everybody.
But isn't that the purpose of getting EMA and FDA approvals? I mean, when we get those,
so we don't trust that general statement. We want to know what has happened for each of the tests, because EMA approval may be for one test and then the company claims that they have EMA approval. We don't know whether it is for one test or multiple tests.
No, I mean, when we, for example, currently sending in our FDA dossier, it is for the entire whole exome sequencing. So it is not for just NTRK or EGFR or ROS or MET. It's for the entire approach, right?
So let's cut this down. If you can share the figures, fine. If you can't share the figures, fine.
Yeah,
but
I can try to.
We need the figures if you can provide it to us.
If one didn't have the figures, why would you not feel safe? Because this is what all other institutions.
Because we have the figures from other labs. What is it that you are trying to not?
No, it's not. I don't want to share. I don't know that I can get if I can get aggregated.
So let's stop at that. I think now I hand over back to Dr. Ratima for giving the vote of thanks.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Purvesh. This was a really very nice and interactive session today. I really thank all my faculty and the participants as well. From the lab perspective, from the GeneEvolve side, Dr. Lal Path Labs, we will try to resolve all the questions which we were put on the diagnostic laboratory, and we would like to streamline all those things so that we are a better lab to service all the oncologists in a better way. So looking forward for many more these sessions and suggestions from you all so that we can gear up to a better therapy and suggestions for our patients. Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot to everybody. Now we close and end the session.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All the panelists, Dr. Govind Babu, Dr. Indu Bansal, Dr. Randeep Singh, Dr. T.P. Sahu, Dr. Vamsi Krishna, Dr. Kshitij, and of course the team from Lal Path Lab and Caris. We had a wonderful interaction, and we have shot well beyond our intended time. So I request everybody to stay safe, be comfortable, and thank you very much for participating in this.
Yes. Thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
And stay safe.
Right. Thank you very much.